Brown rained down 14 blows. I've just acted out 2 there. Imagine the horror, the depth, the extent and the brutality of 14 blows to someone's head. Hello and welcome back to the brand new season of Crime Suspect. Each week we're going to be unravelling some of the UK's most prolific crimes, as well as providing in-depth analysis on the criminality that plagues our nation. On the show today, dealing with the devil. Time is running out to block the release of Robert Brown, who bludgeoned his ex-wife, Joanna Simpson, to death with a claw hammer. Could this cold-blooded killer be back on our streets in just a matter of weeks? Next, is it safe on your street? I'll be taking you, virtually, to Newcastle upon Tyne for this week's Postcode Watch. And finally, it's your chance to book a crook as we show you this week's wanted criminals. Joining me for all of this today is Channel 5 News Correspondent Julian Druker, Barrister Oliver Doherty, and Consultant Psychiatrist Raj Persaud. Thank you all very much for being here. Now, you have the right to remain watching. This is Crime Suspect. On Halloween in 2010, former British Airways pilot Robert Brown killed his ex-wife Joanna Simpson at their former family home in Ascot, within earshot of their 2 young children. Joanna was hit 14 times over the head with a claw hammer in the brutal attack. Brown then wrapped her in a plastic sheet and buried her body in a pre-dug grave in Windsor Great Park. It wasn't until 5 days later that Joanna's body was found. Brown was acquitted of murder, having admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The family of Joanna are pleading to keep the killer behind bars, as they warn no woman will be safe if he is released. Julian, who was Joanna Simpson?
46 years old, hugely liked in that community in Ascot, mum of 2, and, you know, all the community really knew who she was. All the kids would go around and were often around there for dinner parties and, you know, having tea and that sort of thing. Hugely liked, but the problem was her husband often, and we had this during the trial, which I covered part of, she was very warm and he was often sort of making comments to her, and there was this sort of mismatch between them, unfortunately.
Why did the case not attract the publicity that you thought it might do?
It's really unusual. I mean, I covered some of the trial. It was never really headline news. I think it was just dismissed as just a domestic case, unfortunately, and some of that fed through to the trial, as we're going to hear. It was never leading the news compared to, you know, about a few weeks later, Joanna Yates's murder, which we covered together. That was a huge sensation, wasn't it, across Britain. This case, the days where she was missing, it barely registered in the news. There was the detail of him being a pilot that did give it some prominence, but the actual case and then the trial, surprisingly, I mean, especially now, didn't get on that much, and it has come to more prominence due to him being released, possibly hearing from her mum and her best friend in their campaign. But at the time, yes, 13 years ago, it just didn't really register as much.
Now, violence against women and girls in this country is at a completely unacceptable level. In fact, generally speaking, every week, 2 women lose their lives at the hands of their partner or former partner. Do you think it was just regarded as another one of those domestic kind of killings, which is why it wasn't at the top of the news bulletins and on the front pages?
I think so. And ideas like coercive control, which was put into law in sort of 2015, this was several years before that. I mean, the idea of coercive control, probably the jury wouldn't have even known that phrase at the time. So unfortunately, and, you know, his performance when he gave evidence, the juror. I mean, he came across as very sympathetic, clearly, to some of the jurors. And, you know, the details of it, he's sort of painted himself as a sort of henpecked husband going through a difficult divorce. And that was the narrative of the trial, really.
And, of course, he ran a defence of adjusted disorder, which Raj will major on very soon, I'm sure. But that, in part, led to him being convicted of manslaughter and not murder.
Well, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He does half of the sentence. That is the rule. I think now you tend to do 2/3, but this was before that change came in. The way, you know, there is this big debate about him coming out. I mean, the way for him to have stayed in prison would have been to have been found guilty of murder, which is not what happened. He was found guilty of manslaughter.
And that brings me perfectly onto Oliver. So Alex Chalk MP, the Justice Secretary, now has some additional powers, I believe, due to recent legislation. What can and can't he do?
Well, he does have power. He has power to intervene to prevent the automatic release in this case. So the law at the time is that Robert Brown was sentenced, says that once he gets to the halfway point of his sentence, he is eligible for automatic release. What can happen, because of a recent change in the law, is that the Justice Secretary can refer him to the Parole Board, and then the Parole Board will make a decision on whether he can be released or not. Now, what will the Parole Board ask themselves? They will ask themselves, is this man a danger to the public of serious, violent or sexual offences? Now, sexual offences don't seem to come into this case, but so they will be asking themselves, is there a real risk, a serious risk of harm to the public? That then would have to be reviewed at least annually.
So the Justice Secretary cannot block the release, but merely make this referral to the Parole Board.
He can't. He can't block it. It then falls to the Parole Board. So again, in the start of the show, there was reference to the family pleading with the judge not to allow the release. The judge that has sentenced this case now has no power to interfere. This is a Parole Board issue. This is a case which has already been considered both by the sentencing judge when what the right sentence was, and it has also been considered by 3 justices in the Court of Appeal, because originally Mr. Brown said that his sentence that he'd been given was too much, so he appealed the sentence. The Court of Appeal plainly disagreed with that.
Raj, is Robert Brown a danger to the public?
Well, the Parole Board and people thinking about this will think about it in certain ways. One of the things that when psychiatrists are thinking about dangerousness elevates your scale of dangerousness or risk of dangerousness is pre-planning. There was a lot of pre-planning in this case, as came out in the court case. He dug a grave. He dug a grave. Before, it was a very deep grave. He had a lot of preparation in his car in terms of transporting the body. The length of time over which the assault occurred was extensive.
Now, let me just interrupt you there, because this is very important, I think, for the public. Brown rained down 14 blows. I've just acted out 2 there. Imagine the horror, the depth, the extent and the brutality of 14 blows to someone's head.
Yeah, to psychiatrists, that's very, very significant, because most of us involved in some kind of physical altercation after just one blow begin to have second thoughts, because we've got a thing called a violence inhibition mechanism within us. To keep going to the extent of 14 blows, psychiatrists would argue something really quite ominous and significant is occurring. And several other things that are worrying in terms of the pre-planning. This lady put up CCTV to try and protect herself because she was scared of this man. She had extra security lighting, and it looks like it came out in the court case he interfered with all of this. So on the one hand, the other thing that elevates the sense of dangerousness is he was an airline pilot. Therefore, he's very goal-oriented. This is a man who achieves his goals and highly intelligent. On the other hand, some people would say, well, he's a middle-class, educated, intelligent person. He would have learnt his lesson. So those are the kind of considerations people will be thinking about when they're trying to assess his dangerousness. But one final point I want to make is I do believe the court system is flawed. And when it thinks about domestic violence, it kind of thinks that, well, it happened in the context of a difficult relationship and he characterised himself as being henpecked. They're saying to themselves, well, he's not dangerous to the public, he's only dangerous because of that particular dysfunctional relationship. And I'm not convinced that's the correct way to think about these kind of domestic violence cases.
I think that's right, although the parole board are entitled to ask themselves, if this man is released, is he going to pose a danger to future partners? So it may not be to the world at large, but they may say to themselves, well, we think that there is a problem here. He gets into another relationship, he may pose a danger. I'm not saying they will think that, but that is a question that they might ask themselves.
Yes, and it wasn't quite your last point, Raj, because I want to know, what is adjustment disorder?
Well, it's an excellent question. It's a disorder that many people hearing about it will be thinking, I've never heard of this one before. But actually, it's not an uncommon diagnosis. To make the diagnosis, and it's very important to remember, there's no blood test in psychiatry. So if you want to be cynical, you could say, well, it's very convenient to come up with a diagnosis to lower the sentence and to get off with diminished responsibility. But basically, to make the diagnosis of adjustment disorder, there is no blood test. A psychiatrist examines you, and you first of all have to have a life event, something that upset you, and there were several life events the defence argued upset this man.
We all have life events that upset us.
Exactly. Doesn't turn you into someone who, beats someone up with 14 fatal blows. But the other thing is you need a life event and then you need to be very, very upset afterwards. And I think the judge in this case commented that the adjustment disorder seemed to disappear very quickly after the crime was over.
It's very difficult for jurors, Peter. I mean, in this case, you have two psychiatrists, one of them saying, they're both saying this is a thing, but one saying this was integral to this case, and the other saying it wasn't. And the jurors, who do you believe when there's two people of equal knowledge saying completely different things? I mean, that is very difficult in these trials, isn't it?
I think it's important to recognise in this case, this was a situation where the prosecution could have accepted a plea to diminished responsibility. They could have accepted what was said by Mr. Brown. They decided not to. They said, we don't accept, and they would have had the psychiatrist's report. They would have said, we don't accept that, we want the jury to decide. And it went in front of a jury, and the jury would have had two psychiatrists, and they had to decide what they accepted and what they didn't. It's very interesting in this case. I went back and looked at what the Court of Appeal had said. And the family had said to the Court of Appeal, when they considered it, this is the impact this case has had upon us. And the Court of Appeal have said, well, it's been considered by a jury, and effectively we can't go behind what the jury have said.
And as a psychiatrist, I wonder to what extent the jury was influenced by the fact he was an airline pilot. We've all sat on aeroplanes. We invest our trust in airline pilots. And to what extent did that, at some level, maybe even below conscious awareness, sway the jury's assessment of the dangerousness of this man?
There's deference to pilots. I've seen other pilots go on trial, but I mean, in terms of the most trusted occupations, it's often up there. It isn't police officers, it isn't journalists, it certainly isn't politicians anymore. There is trust in pilots, and that certainly came through in this trial. I think one of Joanna's friends had said if this guy could have worn his uniform, he would have done. He was acting like the pilot in the dock, and people seemingly trusted him during his evidence.
Yes, and so we could be just a few short weeks away from that once-upon-a-time pilot Robert Brown coming back onto the streets of the UK. I'm told that the family, who have campaigned quite brilliantly and courageously in their efforts to keep Brown behind bars, will not be told, should he be released, where Brown lives, for example, what his movements are. And that in itself, I think, is grossly unfair to the family, because they might never be able to book a weekend away. Because if they don't know where he is, they're thinking, well, could we be going to a town or the seaside where Brown is perhaps rebuilding his life? What kind of pressure might that bring upon this traumatised family who have courageously campaigned and want to see this man stay behind bars?
Well, that's one of the things that many people looking at this will think is so grossly unfair. This man did not get a life sentence and can put the sentence behind him and is serving a relatively short time in the context of other fatal murders or assaults. But it seems to me the family are left with a life sentence of stress, of worrying, of paranoia, and also this strong, gnawing sense of injustice that their loved one who's died has not been properly served by the justice system.
And loss. Huge, irreplaceable, incredible loss.
I wonder if I can sound an optimistic note in all of this. The death of Joanna Simpson, the brutal murder of Joanna Simpson, is intolerable, and it must be intolerable for her family. I think that there has been a move in the justice system. It's not perfect by any means. It is not perfect. We do have a big problem in this country with violence against women. But I think that there is a shift, and I think it is changing, and I think these sorts of crimes are being taken more seriously by the police and by those within the criminal justice system. There has recently been a very detailed review by Claire Wade, King's Counsel, and she's made a number of recommendations to the Sentencing Council to say when you are dealing with domestic violence, domestic murders, or, as in this case, domestic manslaughters, there are various factors which the sentencing court should look at, which aggravate it and mean people will spend longer in prison. So, small movement it may be, but it is movement in the right direction.
And it is deeply, deeply insulting, I think, to families of victims of domestic murder that the sentencing tariff for somebody convicted of murder within a family home, for example, within a domestic setting, can be only 15 years. And that is surely not long enough for somebody in a murder case who takes the life of another.
I think that's got to be right. The same month that Joanna was murdered, a young woman called Casey Brittle was murdered in Nottinghamshire by a man called Mr. Sanchez. She was beaten to death with her daughter next door with an ironing board. And when he was sentenced, he was given a life sentence because he was convicted of murder with a tariff of only 15 years. And I think most right-thinking people would think that that's simply not enough. It was raised to 20 years on appeal, but perhaps even that's not long enough.
Indeed. Thank you. Now, we reached out to the Ministry of Justice.
Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary Alex Chalk KC said, "I made a commitment to Joanna's family that I would give this case my closest personal attention. Having reviewed all the information available to me, I have blocked Brown's automatic release and referred this case to the Parole Board, using powers we introduced to protect the public from the most dangerous offenders."
And let's hope that the Parole Board make the right decision. In the past, of course, with notable cases such as John Venables and Colin Pitchfork, the Parole Board have got it manifestly wrong. Let's hope all of the aforementioned happens and that the Parole Board get it right. Moving on to this week's Postcode Watch, and we're in Newcastle upon Tyne. Violent crime here makes up 31.7% of all crime, totalling 49,400 crimes. And this number has increased by 3.3% when compared year over year in the period of August 2022 to July 2023. Sexual offences, including violence, is the most common of all crimes reported, totalling 14,123 during 2022, with 460 offences reported here in June 2023 alone. The least common crime is robbery, with 329 offences recorded in 2022. Now, if you happen to live in the city centre and Arthur's Hill, look away now, because they are the most dangerous neighbourhoods to live in, followed by Byker in second place and Elswick as the third most dangerous area. Newcastle's safest neighbourhood is High Heaton, followed by North Jesmond and South Gosforth in third. All right, it's time for the part of the show where we bring you mugs of thugs who are terrorising our streets. But firstly, some successes from our previous appeals. With your help, Levi Edwick from Ottershaw was located by Surrey Police after he was wanted in connection with a burglary investigation. And Matthew Mordecai, who was wanted on prison recall, was also located. He was arrested and is now back behind bars. Thank you very much. Now, moving on to this week's wanted criminals. First up, police are urging the public to stay away from this 19-year-old after a number of weapons were found at a London home. Harry Buchanan is believed to have links to the Camberwell, Brixton and Peckham areas and also to Eastbourne. Next, we have John Casey from Egham, who is wanted on breach of bail conditions. Casey is described as white, medium build, with dark hair and facial hair, although he may now be clean-shaven. Lastly, have you seen Daniel Ruckledge? Police in Wakefield would like to speak to him about robbery and burglary offences. He is described as 5 foot 9 inches tall, of proportionate build, and has tattoos of names on both his arms and wrists. If you think you know or have seen any of these crooks, get in touch anonymously with Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Thanks again. Right, that's all we've got time for this week. Many thanks to Julian, Oliver and Raj. Be sure to leave a comment, like and subscribe, and we'll be back next week for more Crime Suspects.